On the 15th of April 1945, 6,758 men held the centre of the last German line east of Berlin. They were called a parachute division. Jumping from an aircraft was the one thing none of them would ever do. The Soviet plan that opened the next morning was built to erase them with steel before a single Russian rifleman climbed the slope. These were frightened men in a doomed place, holding the last high ground before the German capital. Here is the part the record keeps quiet. Most of that steel fell on empty ground, and the division broke anyway. In 3 days, the 9th Parachute Division stopped existing as a fighting force. This is the story of the wall that was supposed to hold the road to Berlin and how fast it came down. Start with who these men were, because the name lies. The 9th Parachute Division was raised in December of 1944. On paper, it was an elite airborne unit. In truth, it was ground crew. Mechanics, clerks, radio operators and fuel handlers from a Luftwaffe that no longer had planes to fly or fuel to fly them with. They were handed rifles and a proud name and sent to the Oder River to stop the Red Army. Most were frightened men who knew they were out of their depth, and they were right to be afraid. Jump training had stopped months before. Almost none of them had ever left an aircraft in flight. The green paratrooper badge on the sleeve promised a soldier who fell from the sky. The man wearing it had been fixing engines a few weeks earlier. They were also melting away before the battle even started. Sources put the division at around 11,600 men in early April. By the 15th, the count had dropped to 6,758. The exact reasons behind that fall are argued over, but the direction is not. In the days of skirmishing along the river, before Zhukov threw his real weight, the division had already lost most of a third of its strength. It went into the main blow worn down. Their commander was the exception to all of it. Bruno Breuer was a real paratrooper. He had jumped into Crete in 1941 at the head of an airborne regiment, in the largest airborne assault the war had yet seen. Men who served under him on Crete called him hard but fair, and the most humane of the German commanders on the island. By 1945 he was 52, and he led a division of his own service branch that could not do the one thing he was famous for. He knew what he had. He knew what was coming for it. It frightened him. What was coming was the Seelow Heights. The Heights are a low ridge that rises out of the Oder floodplain about 40 miles east of Berlin. From the top, a defender looks down across flat, wet ground toward the river. Behind the ridge, the land runs open toward the German capital. There was no better ground left to stop on, and behind it there was almost no ground at all. The general who understood this was Gotthard Heinrici, one of the steadiest defensive commanders the German army had. Heinrici took over Army Group Vistula in March. He looked at the map and saw that the main highway to Berlin, the old Reichsstrasse 1, ran straight through the town of Seelow. That was where the weight would land, and that was where he stacked his defence. He built 3 lines back to back, about 15 miles deep in places. He had the reservoir upstream opened so the floodplain below the heights turned to swamp. He laid minefields at the crossing points. He thinned his quiet sectors down to almost nothing, so he could feed the guns and men into the centre. Holding that centre, straddling the highway, sat Breuer and his worn-down division of paratroopers who had never jumped. Across the river, Georgy Zhukov had gathered a force that is hard to hold in the mind. Close to 1 million soldiers of the 1st Belarusian Front. More than 3,000 tanks and assault guns. Nearly 9,000 artillery pieces and mortars ranged along the water. Against Theodore Busch's 9th Army of roughly 110,000 men, the arithmetic was not a battle. It was a demolition schedule. The men on the far bank had crossed 1,000 miles of their own burned country to reach this ridge. They had a long account to settle, and Berlin was where it came due. Zhukov meant to open it with the largest bombardment of the war on that front. 9,000 guns would fire 500,000 shells in the first 30 minutes. To attack in darkness and still see, he had 143 anti-aircraft searchlights hauled down from the air defences of Moscow and lined up behind his infantry. At the signal, they would switch on together, throw artificial daylight onto the heights, and blind the defenders while his men crossed the flooded ground. Zhukov himself climbed a bluff on the west bank, called the Right Wine Spur, to watch it begin. Below him, the 8th Guards Army of Vasily Chuikov, the army that had held Stalingrad, waited to lead the assault straight up the highway toward Breuer. That was the plan. 2 things went wrong with it before the first German position fell. The first was the searchlights. When they blazed on in the small hours of the 16th of April, the beams hit the smoke and mist rising off the swamp and bounced back. The light threw the advancing Soviet infantry into hard silhouette from behind and turned them into clean targets for the gunners on the ridge. Soviet officers later said their own men were dazzled and lost in the glare, bunching up against a bright wall, while German machine guns picked them out. The weapon meant to blind the defender had blinded the attacker. The second thing had already happened, in the dark, before a shot was fired. Heinrici had taken Soviet prisoners the day before who gave up the timing of the attack. In the last hours before dawn, he quietly pulled most of his forward troops back from the first trench line to the second. When Zhukov's 9,000 guns opened at 3 in the morning and threw 500,000 shells into the German front in half an hour, much of that metal came down on empty trenches. The greatest barrage of the campaign largely tore up mud and abandoned dugouts. The record credits that single decision with sparing thousands of German defenders the worst 30 minutes of the war. That trick spared much of the line. It did not spare the men in the centre. The 9th Parachute Division held the ground the whole offensive was aimed at. When the shelling lifted and the searchlights failed, the assault did not spread evenly along the river. It funneled toward the highway, toward Seelow, toward Breuer. 1 million men and 3,000 tanks do not need a clever plan when they're all pushing at one hinge. The first waves bogged down in the swamp Heinrici had made, exactly as he had wanted. Tanks sank to the hull in the flooded fields. Infantry waded chest deep in freezing water under fire from the ridge above them. For most of that first day, the attack stalled, and the paratroopers who had never jumped held their line against the point of the largest army on earth. The ground did much of the holding. In front of the heights ran a deep anti-tank ditch the Hauptgraben, about 15 feet deep and 15 feet across, too wide for a tank to cross and swept by fire. Around it lay belts of mines. On the reverse slope, hidden from Soviet observers on the far bank, the Germans had dug in their anti-aircraft guns. The 88mm flak gun was built to reach bombers miles overhead. Lowered to fire flat along the ground, it drove clean through any tank the Soviets sent up the highway. Armour that clawed out of the swamp came over the crest and met that gun waiting for it. Batteries of 88s sighted down the slope turned the approach to Seelow into a field of knocked-out tanks, and each wreck then blocked the tanks trying to come up behind it. They held it hard. A Soviet reconnaissance officer named Pavel Nikiforov, describing the German resistance in these days, put it plainly. Many Germans, he said, seemed to feel that they were going to die anyway, so they might as well die fighting. On the heights that Mood met the best ground the Germans had left, and it cost the attackers by the hour. Zhukov's guardsmen ground forward one village at a time. The heights were not bare slope. Every rise carried a fortified hamlet, and each one had to be cleared under fire from the next. Zhukov's rifle corps pushed toward the village of Gusau on the ridge, and the fight for these strong points swallowed the daylight. A plan that had counted on carrying the whole ridge in a single day was still short of the crest when the light failed. By afternoon, Zhukov knew he was behind schedule. At 3 in the afternoon, he telephoned Stalin and admitted the heights had not fallen. Stalin was cold. He told Zhukov that Konev, driving on Berlin from the south, had already crossed the Neisse River and pushed 6 miles into the German rear. Things have started more successfully for Konev, Stalin said. It was a threat dressed as a status report. Stalin had set his 2 marshals racing each other for the capital, leaving the boundary open so that whoever broke through first could take the city. Zhukov was losing that race, and he knew what losing it would mean for him. He threw away his own timetable. He ordered his tank armies forward before the infantry had cleared the way, sending the 1st Guards tank army straight up the slope into the crush. It jammed the roads. Tanks, guns, trucks and men piled together in the marsh in a target no German observer could miss. The first day cost the Soviets dearly, and the heights still stood at nightfall. But the pressure never came off. It could not. Behind the front were 1 million men who had to reach Berlin before Konev did. On the 17th of April, the second day, the centre began to give. The 9th Parachute Division rallied that morning when it was handed some armoured support, and it struck back. For a few hours the line held, and even bit forward. Then it collapsed again. The weight was simply too much. Former mechanics and clerks were being asked to stop the main effort of a 1 million-man army, and the ground under them was coming apart. They fell back to a railway embankment and used the raised bank as a wall. For a short while, it worked. The embankment gave them cover and a clear field of fire, and the Soviet advance checked in front of it. Then the 5th Shock Army, under Nikolai Berzarin, came at the embankment in strength and forced the survivors off it, pushing them back to the northwest toward Neuhardenberg. The Waffen SS Nordland Division was thrown in beside them to mount a counterattack and steady the front. These were foreign volunteers who had signed on to Hitler's cause and meant to fight for it to the last fanatical, where the ground crew were merely trapped. It bought a few hours. The front did not hold. Every counterattack ran into more Soviet armour than it could touch and fell back further than it had started. Somewhere in those 2 days, the man who had jumped into Crete came apart. Bruno Breuer suffered a nervous breakdown as his division dissolved around him. He was relieved of command on the 18th of April. The order came at the personal demand of Hermann Goering, furious that one of his Luftwaffe divisions was falling to pieces in front of the whole army. It was a cruel piece of blame. Goering had built the division out of men with no business on that ridge, then turned his anger on their commander when it broke the way any such division would break. The veteran of the greatest airborne assault of the war was carried off with his nerve gone, while his frightened ground crew held a ridge they had never been trained to hold. Command passed to Colonel Harry Hermann, who inherited a division that was already more a symbol on a map than a force in the field. By the third morning, the men on the ridge had been fighting with little real rest since the 16th. They had held through the night barrages and the daylight assaults. The counterattacks they were ordered to make gained nothing. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and past hope. The flooded fields in front of them were choked with bogged and burned out vehicles. Fresh Soviet divisions kept arriving to relieve the ones worn down in front of them. Behind the paratroopers, the German line had nothing left to send. A defender can trade ground for time only while he has ground to trade, and behind the heights there was Berlin and almost nothing else. By the 19th of April, the third day, the heights were lost. The German second and third lines had been overrun. What remained of the 9th Parachute Division fell back with the shattered corps it belonged to into the outer defensive ring of Berlin itself. The last wall east of the capital was gone. The road Heinrici had tried to seal stood open. Zhukov's tanks rolled off the wet ground and onto the firm approaches to the city, 4 days late and battered, but moving. Count the cost of holding it, because the numbers are the whole point. Estimates of the Soviet dead in the 3 days for the heights run from several thousand at the low end to above 30,000 at the high end, drawn from a total casualty list several times larger, and historians still argue the true figure. Whichever number is right, Zhukov spent lives at a rate that unsettled his own staff to break a position a subtler approach might have gone around. The Germans lost on the order of 12,000 men on the heights. But the German army did not have 12,000 to give. Zhukov could lose 30,000 and still field most of 1,000,000. Busse could not replace a single company. That was the ratio that decided everything on that ridge. Skill bought the Germans 3 days. Numbers took the ridge, and the Germans stood on the wrong side of the sum. For the 9th Parachute Division, the subtraction ran all the way to 0. The 6,758 men counted on the 15th of April did not regroup as a division. Through the last days of April, the survivors were fed into the fighting inside Berlin and used up street by street. In the first days of May, the remnant tried to break out to the west across the Havel River, hoping to reach the Western Allies rather than surrender to the Red Army. The breakout failed. By the 2nd of May, the 9th Parachute Division had ceased to exist. Its last commander had held it for 2 weeks. Its first real soldier had left the field a broken man. What the ridge had bought was measured in days, and only days. Once the heights fell, there was no other prepared line between the Red Army and Berlin. Within 2 weeks the city was taken. Nikolai Berzarin, whose 5th Shock Army had forced the paratroopers off their railway embankment, would be named the first Soviet commandant of the fallen capital. The wall that the 9th Parachute Division had held to its own destruction delayed that ending by 3 days and changed nothing else about it. The men Zhukov's barrage was designed to erase were mostly missed by it. 500,000 shells in half an hour came down on empty mud, a mile short of where they stood. The German army called that morning a small miracle of timing. It changed nothing for the division at the centre. They held the ground the whole flood was aimed at, and a flood does not need to aim. It only needs to keep coming. In 3 days it climbed the heights, took the highway, and rolled on toward Berlin. They were named for a leap into the sky that none of them ever made. The last thing the 9th Parachute Division ever did was stand still on a ridge and be overrun, holding the door to a war that was already lost, for 3 days, so that the men behind it could lose it a little more slowly.